I Won't Envy is a podcast about professional jealousy in creative fields. In my own career, I've had to confront the fact that jealousy is a byproduct of being an artist, and that no amount of repressing or denying it can make it go away. In fact, my most successful strategy to manage my professional jealousy has been to name it. But what are other strategies? In each episode, I'll be talking to artists in different creative fields to learn about their relationships to professional jealousy and how they've come to understand it and navigate it. I'm Vivek Shraya, and you're listening to I Won't Envy. Today I'm talking to Paul Sepuya. Paul Sepuya is a Los Angeles-based artist working in photography and associate professor in visual arts and MFA program director at UC San Diego. His work is in the collections of the Getty Museum, Guggenheim Museum, Hammer Museum, LACMA, MoMA, SF MoMA, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum, Tate Modern, and Victoria and Albert Museum, among others. I wanted to talk to Paul because I was curious how professional jealousy plays out in the context of the visual art world, which tends to be a bit elusive and even elitist.
Even before it's professional jealousy, I think it's just like jealousy that's like admiration or just inspiration, and it's like a good motivation.
Can you say more about that?
I mean, I think about like being like why I wanted to go to New York, and study photography. And I don't know if I don't think I understood what being an artist was, but I was like inspired by and like jealous of like David LaChapelle or something, but it's like, I don't think you can say it's jealousy when there's such a structural difference between
Yes.
like an admiring like 15-year-old and like someone with like an admirable career. I think something can turn into professional jealousy when suddenly it is amongst peers. But I think that motivation to kind of like catapult us into where we want to be is kind of tied to jealousy, you know?
Yeah, I've never thought about it that way. Yeah.
I graduated from undergrad in 2004. And that was like, I think that moment for those next few years before 2008, where there was like that pre 2008 like art bubble where you were, that's where like the legend of like students, especially from like Columbia and Yale, it's like they would sell out open studios and all of these people right after school getting sellout shows. And then there was this moment of thinking, oh God, I loved my arts administration day job life. Like you kind of have to have that. But I think there was a lot of professional jealousy in like, can I get that break? Like, am I an artist if I'm doing all these other things? Can I sell work, And then that took a long time to resolve, to sort of realize, and I think it was through working on the arts nonprofit, like granting like grants and fellowships and artist support side, that I started to see and realize that a lot of the artists whose work I was seeing in galleries or in museums were those artists who were applying for grants and fellowships because they needed money to continue making their work, and it just demystified some of it. And that really helped in understanding the difference between appearances and like whatever I was feeling and the reality that like, oh, we're all in this together.
Yeah. And would you say that when you felt, whether it's David LaChapelle or these other artists, later in your 20s, were you able to name jealousy to yourself? Were you able to say, I'm feeling jealous? Or was it something that you were like, hands off, you didn't want to touch it, you didn't want to know it kind of thing?
Oh, I think if I'm honest with myself, I would have recognized jealousy, but I don't know if you talked about it so much,
Mm.
I think it also becomes complicated when then you start to become more of a community of artists. And I think about like that network of folks that like the queer zine world, and related artists who I both looked up to, but I think was also jealous of,
Hmm.
but you're friends with, it's just, yeah, I could very well, I think I could honestly say that there was jealousy, but I would like to hope. I think that it was never destructive, or like I've seen that play out
Yes. Yeah.
when jealousy is paired with an idea that, like, in order for me to get ahead, someone else has to be pushed down.
Mm.
Or like, let's just create opportunities for everyone. I think I channeled that into into doing self-initiated opportunities. That's why I started making zines. I was jealous of seeing all these amazing group shows of like young artists and people, and also other people that I admired. And I was like, I don't want to wait for someone to give me an opportunity. Like,
Mm.
let me just use the copy machine at my job and
Oh,
like
wow.
and just make some zines and get stuff out there. And that was helpful in transforming jealousy into conversations that then led to opportunities that then could turn into collaborations. And I like to think of those ways in which everyone made space together.
Cool. Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, again, I don't think we talk about the ways in which jealousy can be turned into something constructive. And I
Mm.
mean, that was actually my next question for you. So I don't know if you have more you want to say on that point, is like when you felt jealous, how have you navigated it? And one of the examples you gave, which is so lovely, is that it mobilized you to create zines. Do you remember anything else? And there's no positive or negative here, but like when you have felt jealous, like how do you manage it? How do you take care of it? How do you recognize it? If it's not naming it, what else? What other strategies do you have when you experience it?
What ways? I think sometimes there is just venting,
Yeah. Yeah.
the kind of thing like, I think honestly, if I do think back, there were necessarily maybe those moments of sitting around like the kitchen table, having beers before going out, like talking about shows that you've seen that you're like, oh, I could have done better, or like, why didn't I have, or yeah, there are those ways in which I think, but I bring it up because I think that is maybe part of the necessity, or part of what's necessary to kind of like move through it, is sometimes you just kind of have to, and then maybe be vulnerable in that situation,
Totally.
and then maybe like regret it. But you kind of at least had to say it, in front of friends that you could trust.
Totally.
I do remember once, I remember like a Wolfgang Tillmans exhibition at MoMA PS1, and maybe it was around 2005 or six. It was like a quite large show, and as an artist who I always looked up to, and I can think at that moment of going to this exhibition at PS1 being like, I'm so jealous. I want this. I want to be able to make work like this. I mean, our work is very different, but because I think jealousy I think comes up more clearly when there's proximity. Like I couldn't say I was ever jealous of like an artist who made just abstraction, or it was like an artist who did like really beautiful landscapes or something. It would be those artists who were like coming from a place of making work in a queer community that's centered on portraiture, that maybe like where experimentation builds off of that. And so that's where you're like, I'm so jealous. But I think that's something that's also important for every like young artist to realize, is that sometimes when you see these exhibitions that just feel so effortless, it's because there's so much work behind it.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
what we're seeing is like, it's really easy for like any of us to take like a picture that looks like Tillman's, but to sustain a practice of that is so much more. And so it's like that jealousy really has to be confronted with like, okay, are we talking about like a one-off, or are we talking about like building a life with this, you know? There's a whole practice and rigor behind it, you know?
And do you feel like you knew that then, or you know that now because of where you are as an artist now?
I've learned it along the way.
Yeah. Because like one of the things I find interesting so far in this conversation is a lot of what we've talked about in our short period of time is that when you talk about jealousy, it's sort of rooted in the past, and I'm actually really curious how it plays out now for you as like, you know, and somebody who comes to your show and potentially sees your work and feels those things, but also you as a contemporary current artist and academic, like how does, you know, jealousy play out in your current world?
Yeah. I mean, it just moves with you. It changes zip codes with you. It like moves apartments with you. And I think about like relationships to galleries, like the opacity of visibility versus, let's say, sales versus what kinds of galleries that people work with, you know. On the one hand, there was a moment where, you know, talking to a few friends who start working with places like Hauser and Worth and Zwerner and Kordansky, it's like, I'm like, am I jealous? And then I'm like, actually, no, that's not what I like. I can't even sort of imagine that. But there is still a kind of jealousy that I think is about the perception of resources and support and stability that might actually not be the case. Because then I was talking to some friends, we were just checking in because there's a whole, I think many galleries and many artists are experiencing like a market slowdown, a kind of delayed correction that really honestly should have happened during COVID, but didn't happen.
Yes, we're seeing that here too.
Yeah, and it was really actually nice to talk to two friends who are artists who I'm like, I feel like we're, you know, on similar levels, but I still sometimes feel jealous of. And we just all were like, oh yeah, we're having to cut back in all these ways. And just being able to share that honestly with each other, where we're like, oh, okay, yeah, you're all downsizing. Okay, I'm downsizing. Okay, we're gonna, you know, um, is I think is really I think it's just really healthy, and I feel fortunate to be able to have honest conversations like that.
We invent a narrative, right? We're like, oh, this person's so supported. They have, you know, this and this, and look at their talent. And we create this story. But then when you actually talk to the artist and you hear that they were up till 3 a.m., putting up the pieces on their own, that, you know, so and so dropped out last minute and they, you know, blah, blah, blah. You're like, oh, like that's totally not how it looks, right? And so I think one of the things I've been wondering about in these conversations is like, how do we become less siloed from each other? I'm curious if you think that there is a relationship between race slash sexuality and jealousy. And just for more context, I'll be honest that when I track the people the artists I've been jealous of, one of the things that comes up for me is often whiteness. And I find myself having to do a lot of work thinking about, am I jealous of privilege? Like, am I jealous of the power and the privilege that comes with whiteness? Am I, you know, jealous of the access? Am I, you know, like, is this about an aspiration to be white? And so I find myself getting a little bit lost there.
I do think that we're just all colonized, and I think there is an aspiration to like the kind of freedom to do whatever the fuck
Mm-hmm.
kind of like whiteness implies. But where I've actually found it that happening is being jealous of the work not having to be about race,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or it being sort of like reduced to that. because
Mm-hmm.
I have a very ambivalent relationship to representation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much like, this is my position as like all of my intersectional identities. I'm a cisgender. It's kind of at this point, I'm sort of like, I'm a cisgender, gay, Black, half American, half African person in a queer social space that is attempting to broaden beyond my own position,
Mm-hmm.
but being honest about where that's at. And also acknowledging that, like, from a position of a kind of complicated Blackness that is always, I feel like, kind of misread. I'm just going to make the work that I want, and that all of it's going to be driven through a kind of like homoerotic desire, contextualized by like a queer political position, and like mediated through Blackness and just how that's perceived. But then sometimes I'm like, I wish sometimes I didn't always have to put that biographical information in order for the work to enter into the room.
Yes. I think that's something I really relate to. And I felt so strongly about 7 or 8 years ago. But I will say that what that did for me in that moment is, as an artist, I said, well, what would it mean to give myself permission? I mean, I'm someone who believes that like my identities will always be part of my work, whether they're at the forefront or not. It is who I am. But what would it mean for it to not be at the forefront? What would it mean if to make work that it's not an agenda to educate or to break barrier, any of that stuff? And I will say, especially like, coming into my 40s as an artist, it's been quite liberating to give myself that permission. I did a children's book about raccoons, and it was like, how joyful. And, I didn't have to like extract anything from myself. And when I was touring the book, I didn't have to talk about how do we solve racism. You know what I mean? Like, it was just a very joyful experience. And I was like, I want to give myself that more. And I also want, younger marginalized artists, however they identify, to also have that freedom. And so I think there is, maybe for me, that's one of the ways in which it's been generative to name that jealousy. So my closing questions for you are just, what have you learned from your jealousy, or what can jealousy teach us?
I've learned to maybe be a little kinder to myself.
Mm,
I think the jealousy has been the worst when I've been the least secure, or been the most, like, whether it's just been creatively, stuck, or in times when I was, insecure in terms of employment, and, being underemployed or unemployed, or housing insecurity, that then, so it's kind of like, just, you gotta kind of just be kind to yourself,
mm,
but also that it's jealousy like revulsion. if you if you can transform it, can be really, really helpful. It can be like, it's an intense feeling, so it shouldn't be sort of like shunned away. It should be looked at.
mm-hmm,
And I can say, why am I jealous? Am I jealous because I have assumptions or prejudices about another person's position? I don't know where they're coming from,
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
don't know. Am I jealous because I just haven't done the work and I'm being a little bit lazy? Am I jealous because it's just something to work with? And I think about it in the same way as, like, sometimes there's like artworks that I remember seeing that just like really upset me, but I just
Mm.
needed to kind of go back and think about them and be like, why was that upsetting? And then I, I might, sometimes I've thought, oh, this work is amazing. And then sometimes I've been like, yeah, that's really bad. But at least I learned something from it. I think of, so I guess, yeah, that jealousy, because it's a strong feeling, just like love or adoration, or when you saw artwork that's just like, oh my God, I love this thing. I think both of them are kind of equal in needing to be sort of like lived with.
I Won't Envy is produced in partnership with Buddies in Bad Times Theater, the world's largest and longest-running queer theater. For 46 years, Buddies has carved out a sexy, disobedient edge in Toronto's theater scene and has been a world leader in developing queer voices and stories for the stage. You can learn more about their programming from theater and festivals to parties and drag shows at their website, buddiesandbadtimes.com, or find them on social media at BuddiesTO. I Won't Envy is a podcast by me, Vivek Shraya. It is recorded, edited, and engineered by Beau Cassidy, with original music by myself, produced by James Bunton. Thank you so much for listening.